Hello, everyone. Welcome to today's show. And if you are joining for the first time, this is part of our digital transformation series, for which we meet every Thursday at 5:30 p.m. Eastern. We pick one topic related to digital transformation, and we always have an expert panel that is willing to share their insights and wisdom. For today, we have a very interesting topic, and probably a little controversial as well, and we are going to have a lot of fun with that. It's called blanket orders. So we are going to touch the topic from many different perspectives, and we have a variety of expertise in the panel. Before we do that, we are going to start with everybody's intros. I am going to start with my intro. If you don't know me, I am Sam Gupta. I'm your host. I've been in the ERP and digital transformation space for roughly 20 years, and blanket orders is always fun to implement. Elevate IQ is the independent ERP and digital transformation consulting firm. We help companies with the ERP selection, implementation, etc. On that note, I am going to move to Abu for his intro.
Thanks, Sam. Hi, everyone. Pleasure to be here. My name is Abu. I'm the founder at Pani. So I've been helping companies improve their supply chain, manufacturing, and distribution processes for the last 12 years. We're also a Sage X3 reseller, which is one of the leading solutions in the food vertical, in the distribution vertical, and manufacturing in general.
Thank you so much for being here, Abu. Dave, can I ask you to introduce yourself next?
Yep, appreciate being on the show today, Sam. My name is David Dozer. I'm the president at Blaze IT. We're a solution provider specializing in cloud ERP solutions for mid-sized manufacturing and distribution companies. Seen a lot of different flavors of purchasing over the years and blanket purchasing, so I think it'll be a great discussion today.
Okay, amazing. Thank you so much for being here. Brent, can I ask you to introduce yourself next?
Sure. So Brent Perekoppi. I've been a procurement leader and consultant for about 25 years now. Worked across a wide swath of industries, everything from retail to food manufacturing, a little bit of e-commerce and energy on the side. I've really built and transformed a number of procurement teams, worked in direct procurement, indirect procurement, the center of excellence or the operations center. And really kind of have a pretty broad perspective on procurement across a number of industries.
Okay, amazing. Thank you so much for being here, Brent. Michele, joining for the first time, can I ask you to introduce yourself next?
Hi, Sam. Thanks for having me. My name is Michele Thompson, and I've held a variety of roles in sourcing, procurement operations, supplier diversity, and I've done several procure-to-pay implementations. Most recently, I was at the London Stock Exchange, and I've been at a variety of information technology companies and financial services companies. Thank you.
Okay, amazing. And Chris, can I ask you to introduce yourself next? Made it in time.
Hi, this is Chris Garridini, president and owner of Turnkey Technologies. We've been implementing Microsoft Dynamics ERP solutions for the past 30 years. Glad to be here, Sam.
Okay, amazing. Thank you so much for being here, Chris. And if you're in the audience and joining for the first time, make sure you guys post your questions and comments. We typically try to cover it during the show. If we cannot get to them because of time, then our panelists are going to make sure that you guys are going to get your questions answered. On that note, I am going to start with the first question with Abu. And the first question is going to be, okay, when we think of the blanket orders, sometimes it could be very confusing when you look at the blanket orders. I personally have always been confused that, okay, you have three different documents or the entities in the system. They have a little subtle differences in terms of how they work. Sometimes people get confused as well. So one is going to be your contract. Then you have the order itself, the order document, and then you have the blanket order. So do you want to touch on the difference in terms of what are going to be the differences in these three and what blanket order really is?
Sure. I mean, so I'll start off with the purchase order. That's probably the most widely used, document, the easiest used one to use and understand. So purchase order is you want to buy something, it's at most one or two times, you have specified delivery dates. That's when, you're going to issue a purchase order. Blanket order would be when you have a recurring, you're going to buy the same thing recurring over the next few months. Some companies even do it for the next 1 year even, it really depends on the company. But you know what you're buying, you're going to buy it every 2 months, what the quantity you're buying. That's when you're going to be using an open PO or a blanket order. A contract, like a contract purchase order, is basically establishes your contract terms. You have established a contract with your buyer, and then you are going to order when you need it, or based on your own needs. You may have a 3-year contract, but you have not specified any delivery dates specifically. So you're going to order something, when you're ready to order, and then the supplier is going to provide that goods or services based on those contractual terms.
Okay, amazing insights there. Do you have any specific examples or the stories in the industries where you have seen the application of blanket order by any chance that you might be able to share, Abu?
Blanket order mostly, I have a supplier. It's sort of used interchangeably. Very few companies, properly, especially in the mid-size sector, that's properly set up a contract order and a blanket order. They tend to use it interchangeably. But if I need a certain kind of raw material from a supplier, I'm in the food industry. I need, a bag of nuts delivered every 2 months. I know the quantity, so that would be a classic case of a blanket order. Uh, a contract would be, I want to enter into a long-term agreement. I want lead time of 4 months. I have a negotiated price of $15 a kilo, for example, but I'm going to order it when I actually need it, right? So the supplier is, I'm going to actually request a supplier. A blanket PO would be, suppliers generally tend to know when they have to deliver it.
Okay, amazing. Thank you so much for those insights. So, Dave, I'm actually going to come to you, and I am looking for. I don't know if you have anything to add there overall in terms of the differences between your contract versus the order versus the blanket order. And then, if you have any stories, I don't know if you're going to have any insights related to injection molding. I mean, that will be very interesting to hear as well.
Yeah, perfect, Sam. And to kind of expand on that a little bit, I do think a lot of times in kind of the small, mid-sized market, there is a lot of I don't want to say confusion, but there's sometimes some ambiguity between those three kind of different types of documents and really how to effectively use those. A lot of times we've gone into customers and you'll see, they technically have a contract and really should be leveraging a blanket PO, but they've literally created just a purchase order in the ERP system, maybe with 12 different lines and different release dates on there. So sometimes, we're not always taking what's happening in the real world with the supplier relationship and the contractual agreements that have been entered with that supplier and translating that into the ERP system effectively, where, really on that blanket PO, you want to be getting that blanket PO entered, and you want to be actually releasing that, to the supplier in specific increments. And, from the injection molding standpoint, I don't necessarily have anything specific to injection molding, but we do work with some plastic manufacturers as well, and they do leverage the blankets a lot as far as, they're entering contracts with their large suppliers, sometimes for a year, sometimes 3 years even, and we'll, have that one base PO number with sometimes up to, 40 or 50 different releases against that one particular purchase order over a agreed upon time frame. So not exactly injection molding, but kind of in that plastic space, and we've leveraged it a lot too, kind of in the tier 2 automotive space as well. So, that kind of secondary supplier. Again, we've seen it used a lot in industries where entering those contracts is beneficial both for you and the supplier, not just from a cost perspective, but from a planning perspective as well, as you're gearing up for your manufacturing and knowing that you're going to have consistent supply coming in and managing that raw material supply to line up with your master production schedule. I'm sure, the others will have a lot to add to that, but, it's something not everyone's using effectively, and it's an opportunity to really leverage the systems you have more in a more impactful way.
Yeah, amazing. And I think I am going to touch on the comment, from Sneha, and I completely agree with her that, in some of the system, implementing blanket order is not really straightforward. So I don't know, Dave, if you're going to have any sort of stories there. I have some stories, some really crazy stories, about this system that I have seen. They were really old. I don't know if blanket orders really existed in 1960. Maybe we'll have a history lesson from Brent.
Get you some history on that for sure. Yeah, and I will say over the years I've had the opportunity to work with some different ERP systems, and this is one area with the blankets that, at least from my experience, a lot of times in finance, the debit's a debit's, credit's credit, things are very consistent. But man, it's all over the place with the implementation of how to manage blankets, and it varies dramatically by ERP system, and it can be a challenge, and it isn't always a very straightforward thing. I've seen some where it is a kind of cumbersome process just to manage those, and you run this whole separate utility to release them and do all of that. So it does, depending on the system you're using, some of them don't really do it, and you kind of have to band-aid your way and hack your way into getting the system together. And then some of the ones that do, it can still be a little bit of overhead to manage that. So it's another area where, having somebody to come in and kind of help you get that aligned is very impactful.
Okay, amazing. Thank you so much. And by the way, Sneha, since you are in the audience, make sure you are sharing your stories. I'm going to make sure that I am going to be sharing my story. And then we have a lot of other folks in the audience. They are going to be sharing their story. I'm pretty sure Chris is going to have 1 million there. Okay, so on that note, I'm actually going to move to Brent. And Brent is going to provide a very different perspective. And he is going to tell us more from the business perspective. First of all, do you really need the blanket order? And is that the right thing to do for the business or not? So, Brent, do you want to touch in terms of what your perspective is overall from the blanket order perspective?
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Sam. Let's start with the thesis. I'm not a real big fan of blanket POs. To me, the blanket PO is a symptom that your system isn't set up very well. And that's kind of the way I look at it. If a PO is easy to write, there's not a lot of difference between writing one PO and writing 12 or 13 or 14 POs. If your contracting processes in your organization are, appropriate, you can write a 1-page or a 2-page or a 3-page contract. You don't need to write a 50-page contract at every point in time. And so if you have those two things right, you don't need a blanket. The challenge with a blanket is kind of what's the purpose of a PO. So a PO for a company is a control document. It enables you to control what's coming into the organization, and it enables finance to predict and forecast future cash flows or required future cash flows. And so if you have a purchase order that has an open amount of variability being delivered over, let's call it a 12-month period of time, you don't have a lot of control. Suppliers can over-deliver early. You don't understand where your financials are going to be. You don't understand if you're running ahead or behind of your need, because fundamentally you've put it in place because it's too difficult to put enough POs in place. It's too difficult to change POs. And so I'm going to tell you that generally once you put that in place, you start to lose control, or your level of control goes down. Often it's being used not because of purchasing, but because AP wants some sort of document. And, to your point, Sam, kind of stories I've seen, people put a contract in place, and then they put a blanket in place, and then they don't put a volume against the blanket and send that document to the supplier. And you sit there and you go, kind of, what's the purpose? And then you get a conflict between what are the terms of your blanket and what are the terms of your contract. Generally with a contract, you're probably going to have things like termination for convenience and nice little things like that. You're not going to find those terms customly in a blanket PO. They're going to be standardized across the organization. And in fact, your blanket could end up in conflict with your contract if you've written a contract and you're using the blanket as an AP management tool. From a supplier side, a blanket is wonderful if it's got a quantity, because it's giving you lots of volume. It's giving you lots of commitment. Now, if it doesn't have volume against it, the blanket's a useless document. You can't take it to your bank. You have no guarantees. Do you really want to plan against it? So, suppliers want POs with quantities and commitments, and that's what they need to operate. The blankets don't give you the control internally that you really need from a purchase order.
Okay, so very interesting perspective there. And I am going to offer some of the examples that I have seen during the comments, when I was putting together the show. Some people commented, especially with the supply chain situation at this point of time, their life is sort of saved because of the blanket order, right? So number one thing is they are able to secure the volume. And you are right that, if you don't have the volume printed on your blanket order, then what's the point of a blanket order? So ideally you want to have that. So Brent, I want you to clarify your position a little bit. So are you completely against blanket order, or would you like to see the volume and the price as part of blanket order, so that, let's say, if you have situations such as of today, where we are going to have the supply chain disruptions, so you can be assured that you are going to have some vendors, they are still going to back out, but at least you have some reliability and the guarantee, number one, the volume, and number two, pricing. So what's your position?
So, if you agree that a purchase order is a contract, if you agree a verbal conversation is a contract, if an email is a contract, if it's really about volume guarantee and price guarantee, you can do it, very easily with an email, with a conversation. Now, a short order form contract gives you power to put other terms in place, like termination, liabilities, other things you may want. And that's just much more powerful than a blanket. In terms of guaranteeing you volume and deliveries, look, if your system's set up right, you can write 10 or 12 POs over a period of time and then adjust them as necessary. That can work just as well if that's all you're trying to do, but that's now going to give you organizational control. You're going to know when those goods arrive every single month, and you can cancel the residuals on those POs and really better manage your understanding of your financial cash position as an organization. So I don't see the value of a blanket if your system's set up right. But if your system isn't set up right, is the right solution to Band-Aid it or fix it?
Okay, amazing. Thank you so much for those insights, Brent. So Michele, I'm actually going to come to you, and I'm going to ask your position overall in terms of the blanket order. So from my perspective, when I look at the blanket order, so when you are signing any sort of purchase order, there's going to be a sales order for the other party. And typically the way they are going to work is, okay, if I have blanket order, then I have some assurance from the customer that how much inventory I'm going to be keeping. So let's say if I am working with 10 different customers, I know that 2 are probably going to back out, but I can at least rely on 8 that they are probably going to be ordering whatever they had mentioned in the blanket PO. And in my mind, that's the purpose of the blanket order, right? If you do this in the form of a PO, the other party does not have any sort of liability. And how are they going to produce the inventory? There's no way for them to forecast. So what is your position overall in terms of the application of blanket order?
So I think there's definitely some pros and cons to the blanket orders. I totally agree with what you just said, Sam. And then Dave, I think you had a lot of great points as well, too. So to me, I think it depends on the specific item you're ordering. I like blanket POs for low risk items specifically. You can also use them for maintenance, MRO type orders as well. And then Sam, like you're saying, for the inventory as well. I think if it's, I do think you have to do your upfront work though, and make sure, okay, is this something that we can forecast? Do we have a good relationship with the supplier? I think that's huge. Are we going to use this supplier, for a time period? So making sure there's no issues with the supplier, no quality issues with the product before you do a blanket PO. So I think all those items are important. You also have to understand, based on what you're buying, is it a commodity or something where the price is going to fluctuate? So have you agreed to a price for your blanket, and then, you know, you could have gotten it, you know, less expensive? But I think too, you know, what was mentioned by Brent, as far as, you know, I think you need the quantity. I think you need the exact dollar amount, because, you know, I remember back when I was doing one of my first ERP implementations, just on the procure to pay side, I actually found a blanket PO that was in place, I mean, for years and years, the same blanket PO. So I think there's things that you have to be careful of. You know, you really have to monitor the blanket POs to make sure there's no leakage. I also saw blanket POs where people were kind of taking wild guesses and putting in a total amount. And well, you know, at least we won't have to adjust the PO. You know, hopefully they'll just come in under. So, you know, you really have to be careful when you're doing blanket POs. But I do think if you have the right policy process, it should be done for these types of items, you know, possibly even this level of risk, this dollar amount. And then you have a way to monitor it as well. Because, you know, when we first kicked off, we were talking about the system. You know, you have to have a good system in place to track all these too. And even kind of begin with the end in mind too. How are they going to be managed? How are they going to be monitored? What's going to happen at year end? Are you going to have to go through this huge exercise where you're closing all these blankets manually? Now your system could do that for you, you know, so think through a lot of that stuff. And it's going to require a lot of customization. So.
Yeah, so true. Completely agree with your insight. So I am going to touch on one of the comments that you made. In my mind, when I look at the blanket orders, typically in my mind, it's always going to be with the high risk items. Okay, I have seen this in industries such as, for example, if you go to steel, okay, the price fluctuates a lot. And they typically not only create the blanket order, they are literally going to store the inventory. Okay, so that's how crazy steel industry is. In the other industries where you are not going to find the items very easily, then obviously they have to have some sort of contract in place. In fabric and rug industry, that's very, very, very common. So now from your perspective, you mentioned that, you know, you definitely want to have for low risk and MRO. In my mind, when I think about this, you know, in case of low risk item, you can get them anyways. So why are you doing, and MRO items are going to be similar as well, because they are going to be low risk, right?
It's, you know, and again, for me, this isn't industry specific. You know, you look at, you know, all of your reoccurring buys with the same supplier for, you know, in my experience, we had tons of reoccurring buys, low level, low dollar amount, low risk. So we put those on blankets. But again, it depends on your industry. If you have something that, you know, your example with steel is perfect, that might be something you'd want to put on a blanket PO if you could lock in to a price. Now, a lot of the things that I've been sourcing recently, and this was before the chip shortage, now the prices always typically come down. So I was always, you know, really careful there. But again, like you're saying, yeah, you want to lock in, you know, so you can get that price. So they'll keep that inventory on site for you. You know, the only thing too I worry about with a blanket PO is typically, and again, it would depend on the supplier and your relationship, but you don't always have the ability to cancel a blanket PO. So.
Yeah, and I can see some merits about, you know, what you mentioned about the low risk and the MRO items. And the reason why companies might do that is to reduce the admin efforts.
Yeah, convenience, reduce the admin, and then sourcing focuses on the more strategic.
Yeah.
So, and again, it depends on the industry. Yep.
Completely agree. Thank you so much, Michelle, for those comments. And Chris, I am going to come to you. So obviously you have seen a lot, you know, in terms of the contract PO, and the blanket orders. And if you have seen any combination of those, because in my mind, I think there will be some combination of those as well. Because Brent is right that if you simply have a blanket purchase order, that's not a real contract. So I don't know if you have seen companies doing both, where
I've
you
seen
have the
them all.
contract.
I've seen them all, Sam. And the magic word for the plastics guy is injection molding is silos. So as you think about, and you guys are dancing all around it, is by industry. So I've touched on a number of different industries that all use blanket POs very efficiently and effectively, but it's not all industries. It's not all products that you're buying. I'll give you some examples here. So again, a few different ones. So for example, I deal with St. Louis Airport. So why would they use a blanket PO? Salt. We need 1 million tons of salt. And so to your point, this is a commodity that they reserve an allocation of inventory at a price for 1 million tons. Okay. And those guys can just drop off truck after truck and they continue to receive against the same PO. Varied quantities. Who cares? The injection molding guy, raw plastic. The guy comes back, he fills up a silo. He's got a blanket PO that he did a strike price for 200,000 pounds or 2,000 tons or whatever of materials at a price. And these guys can show up with a rig and they can unload and fill up all of his silos, and that's it. And they just receive whatever quantity shows up. We got another guy's a chemical processor. He buys polyurethane. Okay, so same thing. He has forecasts of what he needs and he allocates against the supplier's inventory, and they just show up and deliver varied quantities as they refill his tanks. And so you see some different examples there, but it is specific. And again, to get a little deeper, food brokers. Okay, so as we think about the commodities industry, and I'm in between the big behemoths and all the guys down here, and you're thinking, okay, what's that relationship between what's the contract and what are the POs? And then again, they're releasing against these POs, but they're doing strike prices and they're allocating all of the inventory. Actually, in this context in ag, all the production, they allocate it all across contracts. And then again, everybody's got their price, their quantities that they've reserved, and they're doing releases against that. Another great example is people will do a blanket PO to consume a budget, frankly. It's very interesting, as opposed to, hey, I got 100,000. Well, if I just release them one at a time, they consume it. It's almost like allocating a budget. So there's a whole nother perspective besides allocating vendor inventory, right? And so they're allocating a budget, and then they're doing releases against an allocation against the budget. So depending on the industry, and like I said, fertilizers, I had another one. I ran a prison system down in Georgia. Same thing. They're trying to buy and allocate chemicals and fertilizers for crops based on acres of land. So in those industries, it's the same thing. There's not, to the point, Brent, there's not, 200,000 pounds. They show up and deliver. Hey, guess what? We're coming close. Guess what? Once they fulfill that 200,000 pounds, you bet the supplier says, I'm negotiating a new price now. So that's the benefit to the customer, is they're locking price. They're getting an allocation of inventory, worrying about the supplier being able to fulfill that. It's just a different model, but you get the replenishment. They're filling them up. They're varied amounts. These guys show up with the trucks, the tanks to refill these people, whether they're tanks or silos, bins, whatever it may be. But that's the perfect application for it. So that helps.
Okay, amazing. And Chris, I am definitely going to ask you, some things from the technical perspective as well that I have seen. I'll tell you my story in terms of what I have seen. So obviously, a lot of you have been using the term release. And I don't know if you have seen the release as a line item or the entity inside your ERP system where it is going to be a release. And I will tell you why they had done it, okay? So they didn't have the native blanket order functionality. So what they used to do is, for the blanket order, they are going to create some sort of sales order as the blanket order. And as soon as the release is going to come, they are actually going to cancel the line and then either going to create a new order or going to create a new line, because if the system did not support the blanket order functionality. So I don't know if you have seen similar with
the other implementation, to your point, is you can do a PO with 10 lines and 10 quantities and 10 delivery dates, and it's on the same time. The customer's buying from you. You got a sales order with 10 lines, the same product, different quantities, different delivery dates. That's how customers have fulfilled a blanket sales order, where it's pre-composed of what the drop dates are. Same thing on the PO. It's pre-composed about what the dates are. It's a little different than the traditional use of a blanket. That's almost like a standard PO that's implemented to behave like a blanket with multiple releases, but it's really not the same concept. And again, I think in the blanket concept that I use, there's no release. You're not calling this guy and say, hey, my silo's empty. You expect him to be showing up, refilling this thing before it gets empty to fulfill that those quantities. So just a little different. But I get the manual manipulation. And again, out of the context I mentioned, I have not seen people use blanket POs for regular stock refills. So.
Okay, amazing. Thank you so much, Chris, for that. So, Abu, I'm actually going to come to you, and I don't know if you are in a position to touch on this comment. So I think Sneha is trying to say the blanket orders definitely contributed to my Pareto for E and O. Do you have any commentary there by any chance, Abu? on this?
Yeah, I mean, I'll just going to build on, what Chris was saying is, when everything's working good, blanket orders work perfectly, right? But when there's an issue in the delivery, that's when it starts getting complicated, right? So if I have a salt, I have to deliver it every month, but in my system, I'm recording it against the same line, or there's no way for me to run a report afterward if he's fulfilling his delivery time, right? Because the terms may be written separately in some other document. Or if there's a payment schedule, right? So when you have to reconcile payments and you have received against the old blanket order, but there's a new blanket order in the system, right? So those are the sort of issues that you run into when you're trying to reconcile the data. And as Sneha is mentioning in her comments, when you have to figure out delivery lead time, standard deviation, it's when the performance factor, measuring performance comes into play. That's when blanket orders become really hard, to measure. So I mean, just taking on the salt example, if they're delivering salt for the runway every time perfectly, then it's fine. But if they miss it and the planes can't land, then how do you track performance, right? so, so that's the issue, right? And that's where I have seen most of the issues come in, is when you want to track supplier performance for blanket orders.
Okay, amazing. Sorry, Brent, you have a comment?
Yeah. So the funny thing is, as I've been listening to all of these, salt is the one I actually get the most, because it is highly variable. It doesn't talk to you about supplier performance or airport performance. It doesn't give you any measurement. I just need salt to always be there. And if I need 1,000,000 tons or 0, I need it to be there. And I've got to have the risk. It is so fundamental to my operation. So it just has to come in and I have to spend the money. And I actually can get a blanket there. Everywhere else, I'm really struggling with the blanket. So if we speak to MROs, at the end of the day, I want to cap my use of MROs. If we're going to spend 50% more than I planned this month, I want to know right away. I want my supplier calling me. Same thing if we talk about use of resin or plastic in a silo. The amount of plastic or resin I'm using in the silo should be in direct proportion to the amount of production I'm running in the facility. And if my facility use of plastic or resin is dramatically out of scale, I want to be triggered immediately by, we've just run through our monthly purchase order quantity. And a supplier is calling me, it means I've got a leak. It means trucks didn't get delivered that I'm paying for. All of those things trigger actions that get hidden with a blanket. And so it is performance to me that's driving it. But sorry, I had to jump in on that because I get it completely with salt. That makes so much sense to me. But as soon as it's about the core of my business, I want the triggers that a real PO gives me.
Yeah, completely agree, Brent. And by the way, since we are on you right now, do you want to touch on this comment from Sneha? I don't know if you have any insights there. Blanket orders definitely contributed to my Pareto for E&O. Brent.
Yeah, you know what? I'm not even sure I understand Sneha's comment, and that's probably me, not Sneha.
Okay, Michelle, did you have any comments there from business perspective by any chance on her comment?
I agree. I'd probably need a little bit more detail to understand as well.
So, Sneha, maybe you want to clarify your question a little bit more, and then we can probably touch on that. So I am actually going to move to Dave, and I don't know, Dave, if you're going to have any sort of comments here on Chase's comment. And I completely agree with Chase. These are the situations where you are going to have the real utility of the blanket orders. I agree with Brent as well that, blanket order do hide a lot of things. That should be the business triggers that you should know. But in these situations, the blanket orders are going to be really helpful. So do you have any commentary there, Dave?
Yeah, I think one theme that's kind of emerging from the discussion as a whole here is, there's a technical side to managing blanket orders, and there's somewhat of a disconnect between that technical side and then the real life side of living this and what that means for your, relationship and interaction and vendor management and reporting, on the vendor management there. And I think kind of what Chase is maybe alluding here to is, that once you enter into that blanket contract, there is very little transparency. You're not you don't have that same kind of PO by PO contractual piece that you would if you're kind of planning that out. So then it becomes very challenging to manage on-time delivery, to manage those sort of metrics that we're talking about. And, to dovetail onto the salt comment, the salt one doesn't matter as much. I need it, bring it in. And it doesn't matter, just keep it going. So it poses a lot of kind of business and process and even legal challenges on that side, more so really than the nuts and bolts of the technical piece of it. I will say in some of the industries we've worked with, though, you're almost kind of forced into a blanket. And in some regards, we work with one distributor that distributes golf equipment as an example. So every year they have to issue a blanket, to kind of the big manufacturers of the golf equipment there, because that's your only way to lock in and guarantee, that you're going to get that. And that kind of goes back to some of Chris's comments around the allocation of goods. And, so there's a lot of challenges and moving parts and, like mentioned, even legality that goes into the whole process, really.
Okay, could not agree more. Thank you so much, Dave, for that. So Brent, I'm actually coming to you again, and I think Sneha is asking another question, and that is going to be around the consignment contract with suppliers.
That's so I see it here a little bit. The problem is in a consignment contract, there's a whole bunch of liabilities, product lost, controls, all of that not covered in a blanket purchase order. So I would much rather have a contract that governs the relationship, talks about what happens with the consignment goods, who owns it, when does ownership transfer, how is price set, my ability to return goods, what happens if I terminate the contract and I've got consignment goods on hand. None of that stuff's going to be handled in a blanket purchase order. So I don't know what the right answer is in terms of handling that, and I probably would want to think through all of the specific scenarios. But I'm back to I need more than a blanket contract can offer me in terms of this. So.
Okay, amazing. Thank you so much, Brent. Michelle, do you have any commentary there on the consignment contract?
Yeah, just a quick item. So I actually did a consignment deal for one of our data centers, and now none of the other data centers had consignment parts, and I don't like doing things on consignment. It was a bear. I went, all the pros and cons to leadership. To me, there's always more cons in this situation. So, just like Brent was saying, lost items, all the controls, are people using the scanner like they're supposed to use to scan items in and out? We had a pretty robust contract around our consignment policy and process. And again, it was cables and different parts, patch cords for our data center. So, again, it was critical. Now, the other data centers, what they did was a single PO. They managed it. We need, roughly, this amount. And again, I tended to, my distributor, though, I had a good relationship with them, though I had unusual lengths of cable. So they stacked it all for me. Even though it was unusual lengths, I didn't have to worry about anything unused. The contract I negotiated, I had a really long lead time for unused items. I had up to 6 months, which is really unusual, but thankfully we had a good relationship and could negotiate that. But yeah, the consignment program never worked well. So Sneha, we'll touch base offline on consignment.
Okay, amazing. Thank you so much for those insights. And Chris, I'm actually coming to you, and I don't know if you're in a position to touch Kathy's comment here. I'll read it for you. So she's saying that we only accept blanket orders with specific planned delivery dates and a schedule complete with pricing. We'll allow some adjustment to the dates if necessary. It does allow us to purchase from our suppliers, taking advantage of volume prices based on those blankets. Agree, disagree?
No,
What's
I
your
mean that's
position,
one
guys?
facet, and again, even the guys that are getting their silos refilled, I'm sure they've got certain periods in the month that they're expected to be showing up. I don't think it's that random. I think there's some predictability in what dates they're coming to refill those tanks based on the plant's consumption expectations. So they can't show up the tanks are full. But in terms of the planned dates and so forth, like I said, even in that context, I'm sure there's an underlying delivery schedule that embodies, because if I've got 200 tons over 12 months, is it going to be equal drops? Again, that's something that would probably be crafted. So I think there would be visibility of what those delivery dates are. And remember, the salt thing, guys, they're not bringing it as they need it. They got a big pile, and when the cow gets little, they make the pile big again. That's the whole idea. Just, 1,000,000 tons is a lot of salt. So it's not like they call to get salt when they need it. It's all there. I think that's the same thing for the chemicals and some of these other things. So on the consignment comment, I've seen it go both ways. I've seen it where the consignment inventory is now in the other people's ERP system versus it's allocated reserved inventory in the supplier's warehouse. So there's a couple different scenarios. The one where you've already receipted the product, that gets a little more complex because you're like, oh, I got to put it in my system. Do I put it in at zero cost? Well, that screws up my costing and margins. Do I put it in cost, different balance sheet accounts, and then I have to keep track, and then I have to tell the vendor and he invoices me, or I auto create an AP. So there's different models behind that consigned when I've already received it and put it into my system, because it lands on the balance sheet, needs to be insured. And again, how do you trigger that? What did I use? What am I paying for? So I've seen that work. It's just a different implementation approach with some different warehouses and so forth. But that can be effective too. But again, you own the inventory, whether it's in his building, and again, the one where they ship it to you and you don't own it yet. Well, that's kind of nice too. But different examples.
Okay, amazing. Thank you so much, Chris, for that. So, Abu, do you have any comment on this comment or the consignment?
Yeah, I mean, consignments are very hard to manage, right? I mean, there's so many different scenarios. Sometimes, you don't own the inventory, you only pay for it when you use it, right? So, similarly, on the sales side, if you're a retailer, you have the inventory, but you don't really own it, right? So your supplier only invoices you when you actually sell it. What I think people like to use blanket orders is to minimize paperwork, right? If you have to issue a blanket PO every month, it's just 12 POs. And if you have to issue a blanket PO for 100 products, that's, the volume suddenly goes high, right? And the time it takes sometimes to create a PO within the organization, issue it to someone else, for the other organization to accept it, it becomes difficult to manage. So at the end of the day, most people would use blanket POs as a way of minimizing paperwork. And, as soon as there's a performance issue, that's when it becomes really hard and terrible, right? If everything's working like a clockwork, there are no issues, blanket orders work perfectly. As soon as you reconcile data, you have to reconcile contractual obligations, it starts becoming very messy.
Okay, amazing. Thank you so much for those comments. And then Sneha is agreeing with me with my comments, I guess. And then finally, we have some more comments from Sneha. So Dave, I don't know if you're able to cover this. I'll read it for you. So Sneha is saying we need to know our spend and supplier base, our demand, standard deviation of demand during lead time factor, and many more factors, and then decide what the inventory replenishment model should be. Do you agree, disagree, any commentary?
Yeah, I mean, just to kind of speak to that a little bit, in the sense that it's kind of getting into factors that I don't know that blanket POs or entering into those sort of contracts really solve for those per se. Those sort of needs around understanding the demand, deviation of that, what your lead times are, kind of all of those additional factors as well. Really kind of starting to broach into the subject of like materials planning and understanding vendor performance and all of that. And I think the whole concept of the blanket PO can kind of tie into that overall plan when you're looking at what your material plan should be and who you should buy from, and what your approved vendors are and what that looks like. But really a lot of those complexities are coming down to vendor performance, delivery, quality performance. So as you're going through inspection and what sort of defects and things like that you're having, and ultimately all of that could eventually feed into kind of a contract, and I guess too whether or not we should pay for that contract, depending on how good or bad the vendor's doing. So really, it's like a lot of things where as you really start peeling the onion back, so to speak. In this case, the blanket PO is a portion of that, but really getting into what your overall procurement plan as an organization really kind of starts to look like, to be honest.
Okay, amazing. Thank you so much, Dave, for that. So, Brent, I'm actually coming to you, and we have some more intel here in terms of how companies are handling the POs. So, I don't know if you agree with this. So, we have Stephanie in the room, and she's saying that we are like at these companies where we do blanket POs only with the delivery schedules. And this was Kathy's comment before. We only accept blanket orders with the specific planned delivery dates and a schedule complete with pricing.
So I'll come back to probably the first thing I said, that the use of blanket POs is a symptom that your system isn't set up right and that it's too hard to write a PO. If I know when I have all of my delivery dates and I know all of my prices, why am I writing a blanket PO where I lose all of my controls? Because it's easier to write one PO rather than write 12 POs or whatever that is. It's come back to get your system set up right, so it's not difficult to manage a large number of POs, and it's not difficult to change a large number of POs. Kathy does have one comment in there that did get me thinking. And if you are a small purchaser and you don't have leverage over your supplier, and your supplier has said, hey, if you put $100,000 on one purchase order, I'll give you a 2 or 3% rebate on that. And splitting it out over 12 delivery dates on one purchase order, and that gets you that rebate, I can understand doing that. Now, if you're a mid-size or larger company, you should have the leverage to say, look, I'm giving you this volume over the year. You give me that discount on every purchase order, and I'm going to write you 12 purchase orders instead of one. But I can see it in this one circumstance that if you really don't have the power to negotiate. The hard thing now is, though, managing your organization. Are you allowing yourself to default to that because it's less work for your team to negotiate the right amount of controls? Or is it really you don't have the power with your suppliers? And I think that is now, that's a management of your people issue, which is a whole other conversation.
Okay, amazing. Thank you so much, Brent, for that. So, Michelle, I'm actually coming to you, and I think Sneha's clarifying her comment. So, I don't know if you're going to have any comment there. I am going to read it for you. So, Sneha saying that was my comment. If blankets are too long, say 1.5 years, there's a chance that you up buying inventory you don't need, which eventually ends up in excess and obsolescence. I think that's what E&O she meant.
Oh, okay. Okay, that's really helpful. So no, Sneha, I think that's a great point. That's actually one of the items that, I had written down even in my notes here, is to just be really careful as far as forecasting, and, you still have to have a really good contract, so your blanket doesn't replace a master agreement. So again, you should determine up front what happens in an instance like that. So those are some of the things that should be in your contract, quite frankly. And then it depends, because like I said, I've seen blanket POs where they're always limited to calendar year. But then, like I gave the example earlier, I saw one where it was long, and I believe it was close to 5 years, which is crazy. I was shocked when I saw that. And, so clearly stuff wasn't being managed, because again, like we're all saying, you have to have the system set up right too, but then it has to, there has to be some other management, and, the transparency isn't always there. And again, that's why I started off with, the low risk items, because we don't like the fact that we don't have the transparency. We don't want people to think that, oh, I've got this open checkbook now, to spend all this. I'm from a company that grew by acquisition. Strategy is always changing. Things are always in flux. So again, the performance factor, the lack of transparency. I think Chase mentioned the transparency issue too. And just, you really have to manage the heck out of it. And, there could be issues too where, what if there is an issue with the product? I think your contract would also need to take that into account. Do I need to negotiate pricing for a like or alternative product if there is an issue? So, a lot of different ways to do this. So.
Okay, amazing. Thank you so much for those insights, Michelle. So, Chris, I'm actually coming to you, and I don't know if you want to cover this comment or the question. And after that, we are going to open up the floor, and then anybody can take the comment.
Couple things is we go back to the silos and the tanks. The good thing about that is they just can't take any more inventory if they're full. So that whole premise is I always want my tank full. So you know what? It's not like, and I would agree that in the model where you've got a blanket PO and the stuff is going on your warehouse floor, somebody needs to be checking about, are we using it? Because the tanks and the chemicals, that's it. It's full. It's full. The guy goes back. He didn't empty his load. So it's a whole different model there. So just understand that. But there's some complexities there that still need to be managed because, and there's the brokers, the food brokers. The other comment I'll make there is those contracts, you bought it. This isn't, I got a contract for $200,000. I don't have to take that delivery. They expect you to take all that grain, frankly. So in that context, you actually bought the $200,000, and then you're doing releases against that in a different manner as you need it for your production. But again, if you bought 200,000 pounds on the contract, you bought it. A little different model than the chemical where I've got a 12-month contract at a set price. And well, hell, you just didn't use all that consumption, so your tanks didn't get filled as much. And in the end, you didn't really fill that entire blanket PO. So again, by case, I think you're going to see different things. And I agree on if your ERP's tuned up for other products to generate POs based on min-max replenishment or, on-demand type of manufacturing with lead times, there's a lot more control there. That's for darn sure, because you're driving those consumptions based on or purchases based on usage. And again, you may be doing it a blanket. That just gives you a locked price, but there's a little more control in that than having people just dropping stuff at your warehouse every week that, hey, where do we put this? Wait, stop, right? So.
Okay, amazing. So anybody can take this one. It says, as a custom injection molder, we handle some customers different than other when it comes to blanket orders. Do you guys agree, disagree? Anybody can take.
Yeah.
Okay, Dave, go ahead.
I'll kind of jump in a little bit on that one. And I mean, it fits into the theme here that everything is a case by case, type of basis, and depending on what that relationship with customer is too. The plastic manufacturer we work with, they do a lot of molding, so a little different than injection molding, a lot of CNC type of work. But yeah, they'll accept blanket orders from their very large customers. And going back to the earlier point of like who has the power in the relationship, they'll take those blanket orders. They'll set the schedules on that. But guess what? Those giant customers, they all of a sudden drop an order in and say, hey, okay, well, I need this by the end of the week. This isn't part of the blanket. So you're making those adjustments. So a lot of that too, at least in the industries we work with, as far as how you handle those customers that are issuing those blankets to you, has a lot to do with, the volume they're doing, what type of revenue you're actually getting from them, and what the volatility looks like. So I think that's a pretty common thing across, different industries. It all comes down to kind of who has the power relationship and what kind of, end of the day, what dollars you're making off of that.
Okay, go ahead, Chris.
Yeah, so back to the injection molding. So here in town in St. Louis, I've got a couple of, they blow pharmaceutical bottles. So it's the two-way. Their customer's got a blanket, they've got a blanket with their supplier, like keep my plastic tanks full, and the guys on the other make as many pharmaceutical bottles as you can. So there is a couple of complete flow, and a lot of them really are like just as much as you can make. And so a little different by industry. I think that's what I was also seeing. So.
Okay, anybody on this one? It says, my question is really on the consignment contract orders, if anyone on the panel has used that model. Anyone? Okay, Michelle, go.
So when we had this type of program in place, it was the type of model where they delivered everything and we didn't own it until we used it. So that was the model that we used. And then I can get into more detail offline as well.
Okay.
When I've had that model and something similar to that, really what I've done is they invoice me at the end of the month and we create a purchase order that matches what the invoice is.
That's what we did.
Right? Like,
yeah.
You've got to look at it. Is that best practices? Hell no, that's not best practices either. But it is leaving them an open purchase order for a very large sum of money representing multiple months of the same thing happening, a better process. What's the best? What's the least risk?
Yeah, Dave, go.
And I'll say maybe it's important too, and kind of looking at Kathy's comment here around some of their customers share their inventory and their manufacturer to fill those low items. There's some parallels, but also probably some distinction that should be made between true kind of blanket purchase contract versus vendor managed inventory, and those kind of again contractually and from a service standpoint, how those two things maybe intersect, but then are also a little bit different as well, and that's probably a whole other conversation to get into, but again, that's where some complexities fall.
All right, amazing, guys. So the only thing we can take right now is going to be closing advice. Abu, what would be your closing advice, please?
I think in my opinion, when deciding to use it, you have to factor in the marginal benefit of using a blanket order versus using a purchase contract and having a more controlled process by issuing delivery requests or purchase requests. So depending on the product, depending on the dollar value, and depending on the importance of that product to your overall business strategy, that's how you should make the decision. There's no real right or wrong answer. So depending on those factors, it's a business decision that has to be made.
Okay, amazing. Thank you so much for that. Dave, what would be your closing advice, please?
I'll just say through the course of the last hour, Brent has convinced me to never suggest using a blanket order ever again. But in all seriousness, it is something. It's about what your business needs. How to align that with the ERP system. And this is really one of those categories where it is much more about the vendor relationship and contract management, more so than the technical nuts and bolts of it. So it's going to be different for everyone.
Okay, amazing. Thank you so much for that. And Brand actually came with a very focused purpose here in recruiting somebody, and he has already recruited Dave. It's a good job. Okay, Brand, closing advice, please.
Look, I think we all agree on the panel that using blankets compromises control and risk. Fundamentally, that's what's happening. There are some circumstances where it does make sense. But if you're configuring a system from the beginning, you should be trying to figure out how to get rid of as much of the administrative work as you can to optimize your controls. And if there is a little bit left over that you need to do it on blanket, really understand what you're setting yourself up for the long term.
Yeah, completely agree. Thank you so much, Brent, for that. Michelle, what would be your closing advice, please?
I second everything that's been said here. Great advice. And one thing you can do too, just really understand the item that you may want, the item or the service that you may want to get the blanket PO for. And we've talked a lot about systems and management and transparency and the vendor performance. With our systems, we have a test system or a sandbox. Take it through that and see how it's really going to work. Go through the whole process and even have the business potentially involved to get an understanding. Is this going to be a mess? Does it make sense? How are we going to really manage this in real life?
Could not agree more. Thank you so much, Michelle, for that. Chris, what would be your closing advice, please?
Just like everybody said, do your analysis and find that right opportunity where it gives you the advantage and the control and the transparency. And again, the rest of it, just make sure you've configured your replenishment methods correctly so you don't have to use that if it's not appropriate.
Okay, amazing. Thank you so much, guys. So that's it for today. If you joined for the first time, this was part of our digital transformation series, for which we meet every Thursday at 5:30 p.m. Eastern. We pick one topic related to digital transformation, and we always have a very exciting panel that is willing to share their insights and wisdom. So make sure you guys are going to be here next week. We are going to come back with another topic. On that note, thanks everyone for your insights and time tonight.
Have a great day.
Take care. Thanks.
Thanks, Sam. Thanks, everybody.